Okay, good morning. I hope we have a full class today, or everyone able to check into the class today. I had to reset the link and pick a new Zoom link, mostly because for whatever reason, that link is expired, the one we've been using. So I apologize. It seems like we've had some issues with the link for this particular section. And as I was sort of banging around, I got here a little bit early today, and I was sort of working around in our particular Zoom version. And I think we have the enterprise version of Zoom. And it doesn't really let us set recurring meetings beyond like the end of the month, which I don't think anybody understood that was going to be an entire semester long thing. So this idea of recurring meetings using the same link, I think, is a little bit challenging. So what I'm going to ask everyone to do is prior to logging into the Zoom link for every class session, just go into Brightspace, look at, I'll have an updated Zoom link on the announcements page. And I'll take out the old announcements, because those, that way you're not cluttered with just announcement after announcement on that main landing page in Brightspace. And I'll also follow up with the email. And I know I'm sort of filling up your email, but the good news is you can always just delete it once you're on board, and should be no problem. And once again, I'll post the recording to this probably sometime tonight. I would do it earlier in my Monday, Wednesday classes. I'm able to do it simply because there's nobody following me in class. But on Tuesday and Thursday, I've got a class right afterwards, and they're kind of banging down the door. Everybody has to get in. So I have to do it on this computer rather than on the cloud. So I have to physically come back to campus to do that, which I'll do. It's no problem. But look for that usually at night, the Tuesday, Thursday. So that's when you can expect to see those recordings as you had before. Okay, and last week we had a bit of an issue with it didn't seem like I had audio to my recording. I was sort of horrified, and it turns out I think there was something muted on this computer here. That's really nothing you should worry about. But it didn't post until Friday, until I was able to really figure out what was going on there. So okay, all right. So real briefly here, does anybody have any questions about anything before we get going? Hopefully everyone can hear me. I think I'm unmuted. I had recognized to my horror yesterday that I had gone about 5 minutes and when it was muted, and people were raising their hands saying, "You're muted," you know. So and I've got the auto transcription on so that you can follow along in that direction there as well. So I like to just sort of start all my classes just giving a bit of a brief update if you've sort of been out of pocket for a little bit and whatnot as to where we are. We just got a little bit of business to finish up with regard to these introductory chapters. As I mentioned in my announcement yesterday, I usually post an announcement on the Brightspace page to begin every week. And I said that we're just finishing up the odds and ends of these introductory concepts in economics, things which are common to all econ, micro, macro, whatever. And it's going to deal with really one particular model. It's going to be the production possibilities model. If you've ever taken an econ course before, you will have seen it. If not, it will all start from the beginning on that. We'll discuss how that looks. And then we'll get into supply and demand, which is a pretty fundamental bit of content that I think most of us are somewhat familiar with, just living our lives in the real world. And I'm not going to be able to get done with this today, but I will finish up and really we're sort of on track with the schedule. We may even be a little bit ahead of the game. One of the things that's interesting about these live Zoom sessions is that it's really sort of hard to know how quickly we'll move through the content. I think one of the reasons why is there's sort of a lack of sort of interaction here and people raising their hands and whatnot. Even though you're able to, you could raise your hand in Zoom. And I'll try to look over, and I know it may be distracting when I'm looking over there, but I'm just trying to see if anybody's put anything in the chat box or has raised their hand so that I can respond in real time for those of you who are watching it live. Okay, so we'll finish that up on Thursday, and then we'll start to get in. You know, it'll be all macro all the time from that point on. Chapter 6 is really the first true macro chapter, and it sort of lays the foundation for a lot of the concepts that we'll be talking about every class session throughout the rest of the semester. Things like gross domestic product, inflation, and inflation is certainly a topic that's very much on everyone's mind these days. And we'll probably cover I don't think we'll get through all of chapter 6. I think there's a fragment. This is really a really deep chapter. There's a lot going on there, and I really feel like it's incumbent upon me to kind of take my time with it so that everyone is comfortable with all the concepts, because you really got to sort of get that down in order to sort of move forward, because there's so many important topics in chapter 6. And from there, we'll get into things like unemployment and price levels and all that, okay? On Tuesday, next week, we'll, whenever I don't get done with chapter 6, we'll just simply cut off the discussion, and I'll have a review session for the first exam, which is coming up next week. And I think that's the 31st is Tuesday. Oh, wait, no, that's not right, is it? No, it's not, those dates are wrong. I'm sorry. It's 2-1. Is that 2-1 and 2-3? Is that what it is? 2-1 and 2-3? So it's Tuesday, Thursday of next week. So 27th is Thursday, 28th, 31st. Yeah, it's 2-1, 2-3. So anyway, my apologies for that. So anyway, so I'll have a review session, and I'll probably spend, I like to give myself about 30 to 40 minutes, probably 40 minutes more like, to go over what you can expect to see on the exam. The exam will be held on Thursday of next week, so that's a week from this Thursday. And you'll have really 3 options for taking it, just like you have 3 options for attending class. You can either come to class and take it. You'll be here for you to take, or you can take it at one of the testing centers, or which the option which I suspect most of you will avail yourselves of, which is to take it online. And I'll just simply make it available right after class ends on the 3rd in Brightspace. And how you'll get to that is you'll just simply go to the main landing page of our course, click on the course, go to coursework content. It'll be down on the left side under the weekly module, and it'll just say exam 1. And you can start it from there. And I'm going to sort of encourage you to make time to finish. I don't believe Brightspace will let you go in and out, stop, start, go back in, and all that. So I think you'll need to do it all in one session. So make sure you're comfortable, have a cold beverage, all that good stuff, so that you can take that in one sitting. And you'll have until Sunday night in order to do that. Okay, but we'll talk more about that as we get a little bit closer to the exam. So, okay, so questions for me. Looks like we have some more attendees. Hopefully I didn't throw everybody off with the new Zoom link. And I'm a little bit perplexed by why we can't just have one link for the entire semester, but it doesn't look like, I was playing around with this for quite a while this morning. It doesn't look like I can set this all the way through April. So we're going to have to sort of revisit this every time to establish the link. But if you do that, it shouldn't be any problem. If you're reasonably familiar with Zoom, it should be easy to get in. Okay. All right. So questions for me about anything before we get started this morning? Okay. Well, let's go ahead and sort of finish up the basics of the fundamentals of economics that are unique, not just to macro, but our comments have all econ, micro, macro, both. And at this point, we've been talking really about the who, what, when, where, why of economics. So who's doing the producing, who are the economic actors, who's doing the consuming, why they're doing it, and we'll talk about that a bit more in terms of what the motivations are of the various actors, as to what they're up to and why they're doing what they're doing. We've talked a bit about the wheres, the where of economics in terms of what markets people are selling in, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of the hows and sort of the whys, I guess, today. And so I want to build one more model before we sort of take off in order to go to chapter 3, which is really some true model building of individual markets. So I want to talk about a model that we see a lot in economics, and it really frames the issue of choice for us. And so it's called the production possibilities model. Production possibilities model. And this is there's a section in your text that I deliberately have not covered. Number one, it's mostly a micro section that deals with consumption possibilities and the budget line. You can pretty much skip over that if you like, and you're doing a reading. I mean, it doesn't hurt to read it, and it'll probably be somewhat helpful. But we're not really going to talk that much about the economics of individual consumers, other than consumers and the impact on individual consumers from things like inflation and unemployment, things like that. So this model is a model of production. So we're going to focus on that, not the consumption possibilities, but production possibilities. And what the main context of this is the idea that there are choices that are made at the producer level, whether that producer be an individual firm, an entire industry, or really an entire country. And I think that's really the issue that we should sort of focus on here, is whether it's an entire country. We talked last time about this idea of comparative advantage, that why would countries specialize in producing certain things, even though they may not be best in anything? Well, there's only be one best in everything. So it's not the question of being the best at doing something, it's doing what gives you the lowest opportunity cost. That is what you're less bad at, to put it sort of bluntly, is what you as a country should be focusing on. Even if that's simply providing labor power. We've certainly seen lots of countries, including China, begin to really industrialize and develop primarily based upon labor power. So that's one element of it. And when we talk about production possibilities, we're really talking about framing the decision between one choice and the other. So we're going to lay out the first quadrant here, and we're going to talk about the choices that can be made in terms of production. And we'll just say that we've got we'll just say, we'll take the entire economy, let's say. And we've got the production of two goods, good A and good B. Now, right off the bat, I want to address one issue that occasionally arises with this particular model. And it seems to that occasionally people get a bit perplexed by why we would be setting up one good versus another good. That is the idea of why would an economy, even the most primitive economy, produce only two goods, good A and good B. It's not so much about that. And if we really wanted to take this analysis further, we could simply extend this to have multiple graphs all the way across the room, and probably using computers to focus on, if we do more of this, we do less of this, etc. But that's not really the point. And in fact, what it really is, the point is that there very often in economics, we are faced with a choice of doing one thing or the other. And by doing one thing and not the other thing, we have to deliberately give up doing something else. And so when we talk about good A and good B, it's really a choice of alternatives. And in fact, we'll give a more concrete example here that will show some of these alternatives here in a second. So what does this look like? What does this model look like? So we're going to construct a downward sloping curve like that. It's concave downward, and I'll talk about why that is the case in a second. This particular curve itself is what we call the production possibilities frontier, the PPF, the frontier. Now, why is it known as a frontier? Well, what does a frontier represent? A frontier really represents the outer edge of something, doesn't it? The outer limit of where production is in a particular. And so what we're saying with regard to the frontier is that this is the outer limit of what can be produced at a given time. Given what? Well, given the productive resources that the economy is faced with. That is, given the labor supply, that is the size of the labor force, the capital goods. Remember, we talked about the input factors, land, labor, capital, land being sort of a euphemism for the natural resources available, labor, capital, entrepreneurability. That right now, this is the maximum that can be produced along this production possibilities frontier. And then everywhere along this line, or along this curve here, represents points of productive efficiency. Productive efficiency. Basically, what that really means, simply put, is the idea that all resources are being utilized to the maximum, and that there's no unutilized resources, no slack, in other words, in the productive use of the resources in the economy. So we can produce various combinations along this particular curve. And in so doing, we are using the most of our resources. Okay. If we're operating at some point inside the curve, this is what would be known as productively inefficient or productive inefficiency. And I'll just keep the same kind of methodology. Productive inefficiency, which in the, let's spell that right, inefficiency, which in the parlance of macroeconomics is simply what we would refer to as unemployment. And I know that we've all heard the term unemployment before, clearly. We all know what that is. in macro, though, we're going to sort of expand the definition of unemployment to extend beyond only labor unemployment, and also the unemployment of all productive resources, capital goods, etc. Because that's really what unemployment really is from a broader, bigger picture macro perspective, which is what we're going for in this class, is the idea that not only is labor not working, not being utilized to its most productive capacity, but if it were used, we could produce somewhere at a higher level and be at full employment, and we'll define that a little bit more concretely later. But it's not just labor, it's also capital goods, 18-wheelers, not hauling merchandise. Firms that were doing 3 shifts now are only operating at 2 shifts, maybe have operating at less than capacity in terms of ideal labor force. And so those are productively inefficient combinations anywhere inside this particular curve, okay? So when we talk about this idea of operating somewhere, let's just say that we are operating at the efficient point. And let's say that we are operating somewhere here. And we'll just say we're operating at this point here, and that represents a combination of inputs and outputs. And so we'll say this is A1 and B1, A1 and B1. And let's say that is we're producing some quantity. By the way, these are quantities, right? Quantity of good A, quantity of good B. We will certainly be looking at examples of axes in which have dollar figures and percentages and all that. But for right now, these are both quantities. And so let's say the choice then is to produce more of good A. In other words, more good A is produced. And in so doing, we produce less of good B. More good A results in less good B. And this is simply a reflection of the downward slope of this particular curve. Remember, a downward sloping curve. Hello, are you from macro? People keep popping in the room, and I don't think they really want to stay. What was I saying here? So when we talk about this idea of producing more of one, the downward slope to the curve. Any kind of downward sloping curve in this particular first quadrant means that if one variable goes up, the other thing goes down. And that's simply the trade-off that exists. So a trade-off exists, okay, whenever a different combination is chosen, okay? And a trade-off is simply, I do one thing and I have to give up something else. A trade-off exists, which is the opportunity cost. And it's the opportunity cost is the opportunity of having produced more B. Okay. So it's, in other words, of having produced the difference between B2 and B1. Okay. So more B, right? In other words, the difference between B2 and B1, this difference here is what's given up in order to produce more of good A. In this case, the width of the corridors is relatively equivalent. So we could say maybe that's an equivalent trade-off. Now, let me just make this a little bit less abstract. Instead of talking about good A and good B, maybe we can sort of link this back to something that is a little bit more in line with what we have, what we see throughout the social sciences, where you've got this particular concoction of, say, guns and butter. Guns and butter. And I didn't invent these two terms here, and you may have come across these before, but what we're really talking about here is a society's choice. Remember, this is a macro course, and so we're talking about the choices that society makes in order to produce one thing and to give up some production of another. I'm going to go ahead and erase some of this just to kind of make this a little easier to see. The beauty of Zoom is you can always go back and look at what we've done before and whatnot. So, okay, so guns and butter. So let's just sort of rename these variables here, G1 and G2. We keep the B there. And what are we really talking about here when we talk about guns and butter? Well, when we're talking about guns, what we're really talking about primarily is maybe not guns per se, but rather capital goods. That is the production of machinery and technology and things that are used primarily to build upon to make other goods. And butter, we would really, is really a euphemism here for consumer goods. So it's maybe not butter per se, but rather all consumer goods, including things like healthcare and education and things of that nature. And so we very often are faced with this. So if this looks like it's an oversimplification of any kind of an economy, because yes, I would agree that even the most underdeveloped economy produces more than two outputs, but that's not really so much the issue. The issue is one of choice. And that is, if it's possible to do more of one thing, then we do it only by giving up the opportunity to do another thing. And I do kind of miss our old textbook. I'm sure students don't, because it was a pretty costly text, and what we've got now is free. So I think that trade-off is good. But but I say it only because there was a great article there that talked about choices that are made. This was in the context of labor choices, of people who decided to forego college in order to pursue something. And I think Tiger Woods was one example. Bill Gates was another example. People who just who decided that they could always go back to college, but they wanted to go pursue something else. And obviously that worked out for Tiger Woods. It kind of worked out for Bill Gates. Not all the time does that happen to work out, but in these cases they did. In other words, choices were made, and because choices were made, other things were given up in order to do that, right? So and think about this right now. This is sort of playing out before our eyes at the moment, because if we think about one consumer good like education, here in New Mexico, we're seeing teachers, K through 12 teachers, at the State House, at the Roundhouse in Santa Fe, who are arguing for more commitment to education, which is clearly a consumer good. Now, obviously, we're talking about the public school system, and that's a publicly provided thing, where this is more about a model dealing with the private sector. But it's the same kind of idea in the sense of trade-off, because if we commit more to education, then maybe we commit less to something else. So maybe reversing this flow here, maybe more of this and less of that might be a good thing. Maybe less support for the spaceport, for instance. I don't know. It's one of various alternatives, because I know that we've got sort of a crisis right now with staffing in the public schools, and of course, a lot of us have probably seen on the news where National Guard troops are actually staffing classrooms, which that to me is just unheard of. And I don't know how that works, but I'm glad we don't have that problem here. And by the way, when we talk about guns and butter, this has all kinds of ramifications, even nationally, with regard to how a society allocates its production of resources, including how government, through government policy, directs those resources. And I know that it's controversial. So I know that during the Iraq War, beginning in 2003, it was rather controversial, I think it's safe to say. And a lot of people were saying, why are we committing all those resources to that instead of doing other things? And I recall seeing an interview on TV with the then mayor of Philadelphia, who said that one day's spending on the Iraq War could have been diverted to completely rebuilding all of the public housing in Philadelphia. I don't know if those numbers are right. I don't know where he got that information, but you get the idea. It's that debate as to how a society allocates its production. So consumer goods, capital goods, you can sort of reverse the flow here. And if you wanted to say we want more consumer goods, less capital goods, that is the opportunity. So a trade-off exists, which is the opportunity cost. Oh, that should say opportunity cost of having produced more good B, more good B. Trade-off exists. And remember, opportunity cost is defined as the value of a foregone opportunity. Value of a foregone opportunity. And when we're being very specific, we're talking about a specific example. Very often what we're really talking about is the value of the best foregone alternative. And I don't know that this has always captured this or understood this well in the business world, because I can recall when I was in the corporate world, I was working in banking, that we were engaging in a marketing campaign, and our marketing director had really very little business background. I think he was an attorney by training, and sort of fell into marketing as sort of a second career, which anyway, it's odd. But we came up with like A, B, and C alternatives. A committee recommended A, and he really liked A and B. He said, well, B is such a good idea. Why don't we do both A and B? Which is a complete lack of recognition of the fact that because we do one thing, we really can't do another, at least that well, unless we have a bigger budget to do it, so that we can do both A and B. Otherwise, we end up watering everything down. We do a little bit of A, a little bit of B, and that's not maybe what we're really shooting for. Sometimes it's important to commit and go sort of all in. Andrew Carnegie, the great steel baron, said that there are really only very few things that we do well, so we should do those things that we do well. And so he was very good at making steel, which led him to make money. Okay, so anyway, so questions about the production possibilities model as to what it's pointing to. Okay, so I've got, I'm just kind of making sure no one's got their hand up or whatever. There are a couple other ideas that I want to run with here on this, and I want to talk about this idea of the sort of the scale of this. So let's say that we keep our sort of methodology here, guns and butter, and or whatever, good A, good B, whichever you prefer. It doesn't really make any difference. It's the idea of what we're trying to illustrate. And remember, we've got this sort of concave downward. By concave, I mean that it looks like that, as opposed to convex, which would look like that, right? Now, obviously, that's I have tried to keep the math to a minimum, but in this case, it's sort of important for us to recognize what's going on. And that is that we need to recognize that there are all these points of efficiency that are considered productively efficient, right? But think about this, as we get going here and we approach the either axis, let's say that we are operating here at some sort of G1 and some sort of B1 here, and we want to produce just a little bit more G2, we end up giving up quite a lot of B in relation to that. We give a lot more B in relation to that. So because the width of this corridor here is that, right, almost imperceptibly small, and the width of that corridor there, what's given up is greater. And so what's going on is that we get a bigger, it's not an equivalent trade-off, like it sort of is here toward the middle of that, sort of that sweet spot of the curve. And so what's going on here is that there's an increasing opportunity cost. And that is the reason for the concavity of this curve is the idea that it gets more vertical as it approaches the horizontal, more horizontal as it approaches the vertical, meaning that the slope accelerates as it goes this way and decelerates as it's going this way, meaning the trade-offs become larger. We could simply do the same thing at this intercept here, whereas if we're producing more butter, we produce just a little bit more butter and we produce a lot less guns as a result of the trade-off. And what this is really saying is that as you commit to doing more of one thing and less of the other, that you really are misallocating resources. Yes, you're productively efficient, everyone's working, all the resources are being utilized, but you're really not doing the right things because you're producing too much of something. In this case, the term guns in the case of North Korea is probably a pretty apt example because this is an example of a country that's wildly imbalanced. Of course, it's a command economy. And remember in the readings what command economies are all about. Government-directed economies that don't really allow private actors to respond to what the needs and wants are of citizens. And so as a result, they simply decide they're going to massively invest in spending on weapons systems to the point where literally, I think one estimate was that 2 million North Koreans have starved to death. And this is a somewhat industrialized country. Their neighbor to the south is a very modern economy. If you've ever been to South Korea, it's a very modern economy. Looks a lot like Japan in that sense. It's a very busy country, very urban, very productive, very crowded, but also very prosperous sort of country. And whereas the neighbor to the north is, and I've never been to the north, but is obviously massively overinvesting in this to the point where they're really starving their economy. But you can only do it through a command economy. And command economies basically are run by coercion and authoritarian governments. I don't think that's too controversial of a statement. I think the great economist Milton Friedman talked about the fact that economic freedom and political freedom go hand in hand. In fact, he really said that economic freedom must precede political freedom. I think some would disagree with the order of that, but I think most would agree that they both go together. So command economies tend to have this imbalance, and they could be an imbalance in the other direction as well. You can have an economy that really spends nothing on things like infrastructure, like bridges and roads and telecommunications and all that, and as a result is dedicating most all of its resources to consumer goods just to keep the population alive. And that's also not a particularly good thing either. So when we talk about this idea of efficiency, it's one thing to be productively efficient and utilizing all the resources. In other words, staying out of the interior region, which is considered to be unemployment. But there's also another element of efficiency that's known as allocative efficiency. The allocative efficiency basically is this, where suppliers produce the goods that society most wants and demands. Suppliers produce the goods, and I'll just say produce outputs. So I think we should get used to using the term outputs that society most wants and demands. And when I say wants here, again, I come back to this thing that we talked about earlier, that is wants versus needs, because in a lot of modern economies, what we're really producing more of than anything else are wants. And the demand then, which we're going to get into here shortly, is really sort of the functional manifestation of our wants. How do we want things? Well, we want them by demanding them in the marketplace. And suppliers who are free to choose what they produce those outputs society most wants and demands. And I realize, of course, that we have needs that are being met, sometimes not being met. Healthcare sort of comes to mind as being one example. And by the way, healthcare, during the healthcare debate, when the Affordable Care Act was being produced, there was all this argument about why the United States does not have a universal healthcare system of like a Medicare for all, like almost all the industrial world, with the exception of us. And the critics of the current healthcare system said, well, it's because we've got a gigantic military, far bigger, far bigger than any other military in the world. So we would have to dial that down in order to provide healthcare for all of our citizens. So it depends on what your point of view is. And again, yeah, it's controversial, but as I said on day one of the class, a lot of these questions are controversial and people will disagree as to what priorities should be. Again, that normative economic statement, what should be. So allocative efficiency, suppliers produce the output that society most wants and demands. And that is, it's really an expression of free market economics, because we know that in command economies, they tend to be very centrally controlled by government bureaucrats who decide what's going to be produced, how much and when and what type. And sort of the classic examples are things like the old Soviet Union, where if you wanted to buy a car, you had to get your name on a list, and then maybe in a couple of years, you got a car, and it was going to be this color, it was going to be a black car, not a white car, not a red car, all that. We talked about this before. This idea of choice is lacking in those particular circumstances. Okay. All right, so that's what allocative efficiency is. Also, one other element of this is the idea that there are those who argue that maybe the US in terms of food production does not create allocative efficiency because we have such a large fast food industry and a junk food industry, which a lot of people consume a lot of. And as a result, the feeling is that Americans are less healthy as a result of those poor choices that consumers make, even though consumers want and demand them. It's probably, I guess you could say, well, it is efficient because that's what people want. People want salty snacks and sugary snacks and fast food and whatnot, but maybe it's not the best choice. So maybe it's allocatively efficient, but maybe it's not the best thing for us. Maybe we should have more fruits and vegetables. Anyway, I'm not trying to sound like your mother here. I'm just simply saying that those are alternatives and decisions that have to be sort of worked out. And again, as consumers, we are free to make our own choices as to what we choose to consume. Okay. All right. So questions so far about any of this? One final bit before we move on. I'm going to go and erase some of this, and that really has a lot to do with where we're going here in macro. Much more than even though we discussed this in micro, this really has a lot more to do with where we're going, and that is this. That let's just go back to our generic good A and good B here, and because it could be anything. It could be healthcare versus highways. It could be public education versus I don't know, wireless for all. I don't know. It doesn't really make any difference. It's the choices that are made by society. So good A, good B. And here's the thing. So if we've got a PPF, this downward sloping function, looking at something like that. And then your text gets pretty in depth into this discussion about production possibilities. That might seem like, okay, well, all right, yes, but we're sort of locked in, we're sort of fenced in. If we are going to produce A1, we're still sort of locked into producing some quantity of good B. So we're only really not getting all the way there. By the way, these dashed lines that we use, and I probably should have described what was going on. They're simply, they don't really exist. We're just simply doing it little tracers to drag it down to the intercept. So you could, the intercepts, the ordered pair here that we've got A1, B1 being the ordered pair. So, and we'll see these throughout economics. That is all we're doing is sort of little hash marks to sort of trace those to where they are. So it seems like, okay, well, we're sort of stuck there. That is, if I want to produce more of good A, then I have to give up some of good B. Why can't I have both good A and good B? Well, you can. And I'll go back to the example that I gave before, where we were talking about different marketing plans and where our division manager said, why not do good A and good B, right? Or choice A and choice B. Well, to do that, we'd have to have a bigger budget, right? That's what we said. We couldn't do it. We couldn't do it with what we already had. Well, what about this? What about if the pie itself becomes bigger? That is, if we're able to produce more over time, and so as a result, we're able to sort of push things outward. And so as a result of this, we're able to indeed have, that's not immediate, it's not in the short run, it's more of a long-term proposition, where you've got this idea of an expansion path, and that you have more good A and more good B, you've got more of both going on. And what this really represents, this pushing outward, is simply what we refer to as economic growth. And where does economic growth come from? I think there's a chapter that we're going to skip over just in the interest of time that is really interesting, that talks about the sort of the mathematics of growth, and that how, you know, an economy could potentially double in every 7 years in its size. And we have certainly seen that happen. You know, if we just take our economy, if you go back to 1985, for instance, I think we're at about $4 trillion of output, which seems like a lot of money until you consider the fact that today we're just north of $20 trillion of output. So about 500 or 600 times the output level of about 35 years ago. So the economy can grow and does grow. And how does it grow? What are the drivers of growth? One big one is population, frankly. As our population gets bigger, we have a bigger workforce, more people working, producing, buying. Remember, the buying and selling go hand in hand. The production and consumption go hand in hand, so we get a bigger amount of output. And so because of that, we can have more A and more B. To the point where, and this is where I think free market economics has sort of won the debate. I don't know that it had won by the time that when I was an undergraduate, because I think there were a lot of people, particularly in universities, who were saying that, oh, there are a lot of rough edges to capitalism and its free markets, and that maybe command economies may not have the fastest growth, but at least have the more equitable distribution, and it kind of takes off the rough edges of society. True, maybe, but the problem is you don't get the growth, you don't get the benefits of growth, including things like you know, better healthcare, better living standards. It's been pointed out today, and I know this sounds just absolutely wacky, but that even among some, with the exception of the homeless and who've got a uniquely difficult way to live, I mean, we see homeless in Albuquerque, and I cannot imagine how miserable that existence is. But for those who at least have dwellings, it's been pointed out that they probably live better than did Roman emperors back 2,000 years ago. Yes, that sounds crazy. That sounds, and it's not trying to be insensitive to the poor, but at least the poor today have access to emergency medicine that can actually save their lives if they need it. They have generally adequate nutrition. Most have air conditioning, all that sort of thing, and you know, are able to survive into, you know, pretty close to old age, which old age used to be somewhere in the 40s. Today, old age really sort of begins somewhere in the 70s, which is good news for people like me. As I'm getting closer, I don't feel quite so old. I'm not 70 yet, but I'm not that close to it. But you get the idea that we've been able to push back life expectancy because of that. Life expectancy has taken a bit of a downtick in the last couple of years because of COVID, but nonetheless, the trend, assuming that COVID, we ever get it behind us, that we should be able to, continue that upward trajectory. And there may be a natural limit to it. I don't know. Okay. All right. So that's the production possibilities. It's the idea of how allocation happens and what the choices are that society makes in order to arrive at economic growth, which is really the objective. And by the way, if we ask economists, particularly macroeconomists, what is the objective of economics? In other words, it's one thing to study macroeconomics. It's kind of like studying dentistry, I guess, right? It may not be the most pleasant of subjects, but why study it? Well, so that you can fix problems, right? So you study dentistry, so you can solve dental problems. And why study macroeconomics? In order to solve macroeconomic problems. Well, then what problems are we seeking to overcome? And more importantly, what is our objective? And the objective is non-inflationary economic growth. In other words, the maximum non-inflationary economic growth, which we haven't really talked much about inflation. We will get to that very quickly. If not on Thursday, we will get to it next week. Okay. All right. So let's, if there are any questions, let me see if anybody have any questions for me. Let's move on to talk about chapter 3. So chapter 3 is really sort of a foundational concept. And I wish I had my PowerPoint slides. And again, I'm still sort of going around and around with distance learning. And I've been sort of shunted to a couple of different people, and they can't seem to understand what I'm doing. What my concern is, I'm wondering if maybe it's me, if maybe it's my computer that is just not viewing these things correctly. So I'm going to actually walk over to distance learning after class and see if we can, or after my office hours, just to see whether or not we can resolve this issue, because I do want these to be available to you, particularly in some of the discussions about what we call the determinants of demand, the determinants of supply. So we'll get to that. And if for some reason we are completely unable to resolve it, I will email everybody those slide packages, so you've got those in preparation for the exam. To the extent that they're useful, I do want to make them available. They usually would go within the week's module within Brightspace. Okay. All right. So demand and supply. What is it? Well, okay. So I said at the outset that when we talk about supply and demand, these are obviously very commonly familiar concepts, right? We've all heard demand and supply. There's nothing, and usually it's in the form of supply and demand, and to the point where if somebody says, "Hey, why does this cost what it costs?" Somebody would say, "Well, it's supply and demand." Now, we as economists would say, we would make a distinction between cost and price and say, why is something priced the way it is? Cost being the cost to produce the good, price being the exchange value of the good in the market. Nonetheless, you get the idea. Why is something priced the way it is? Because of supply and demand dynamics. And so I think just living in a market economy, we have these instinctive ideas of what these are about. But I want to get a little bit more technical with regard to these and talk about the configuration of these so that we know what's going on. So if we take our basic first quadrant plan that we're going to be working in throughout the term here, and we will say that when we deal with, and we'll violate this a little bit later, but we tend to plot things of a dollar figure on the vertical axis in economics and things of a countable nature on the horizontal axis. And the reasons for that are completely arbitrary. Mathematicians would probably have us reverse these, but nonetheless, this is the methodology that has been in use now for a couple of hundred years, and so it's probably a little bit too late to change ways. So what about demand? And let's give a definition of what demand is. We'll take demand first, and then we'll take supply. Okay, how about we do that? We'll take demand first, and we'll take supply, and we'll talk about what these are all about. So we talk about demand. I think we all know what demand is, but let's give a formal definition. And again, I wish I had my PowerPoint slides available to you, because it would save me a bit of writing, but that's okay. It's not a big deal. So what is demand? This is basically the definition of demand from an economist's standpoint. It's the ability and willingness of buyers, or would-be buyers, whichever you prefer, the ability and willingness of buyers to purchase quantities of goods at various prices. Okay? To purchase goods at various prices and quantities. Okay, so that word is buyers. I didn't write that very clearly, did I? Buyers. to purchase goods at various prices and quantities. Okay, so when we are talking about prices and quantities together, let's just say that we're going to call this dollar figure the price of the good, and this numerical figure the quantity of the good. So PQ, this is sometimes called a PQ plane. PQ plane, a first quadrant plane, also known as the basic market model. The basic market model, and it's the model that you will see everywhere if you are looking for models of demand and supply. And if you were to go and Google demand and supply, you would have millions and tens of millions, hundreds of millions of hits probably, and you'd have the same particular configuration. So let's talk about demand. Let's sort of break into this definition a bit here. It's really got to be both things. It's got to be ability and willingness of buyers to purchase goods at various prices and quantities. The ability's got to be there, because if you don't have the ability to purchase a good, then that really doesn't make you on the demand side. So you may have the willingness to purchase expensive diamonds or designer clothing, but really don't have the ability to afford it, can't pay for it. So as a result, that probably does not make you on the demand side. As a result of this, suppliers pride themselves on knowing who's on the demand side. They probably would not market diamonds, high-end merchandise to, say, college students, right? In a student newspaper like the Daily Logo, you probably wouldn't advertise Cartier diamonds or something like that, right? At some point, yes, as you move through your life cycle, that could be definitely a choice, but that's probably not the right demand segment. So you may have the willingness, but not the ability. Likewise, you may have the ability, but not the willingness. So you can have the ability to buy whatever you want to buy, but don't have the willingness to do it. Right now, we have seen a tendency on the part of billionaires to want to go into space. Some of them said, I'm not going to go into space. They've got the ability to go. Some billionaires have said they're not going to go into space. And so they certainly have the ability, which it's a rather expensive proposition, but they don't have the willingness to do it. So they've got to be both together, right? So anybody who doesn't want to go into space and pay the money to do that would therefore also not be on the demand side. So it's the willingness and ability to purchase goods at various prices and quantities. Now, as to various prices and quantities, how do we arrive at what a configuration of demand is? Well, there's a process in economics known as demand estimation, and it's used not just by economists, but also by, well, probably more by the supply side than by the demand side, quite frankly. Sellers, and I've long said this, that sellers probably have a bigger burden than buyers in most markets. Because not only do they have to understand what their own situation is with regard to cost and output and employment of resources like labor, but they've also got to figure out what the heck's going on with the demand side. And it could be a demand side which is changing, that something is going on that is changing demand. So they have to figure out what buyers' needs are, what their preferences are, and then they could change. And we're going to talk about change here in a little bit. So by various measures, suppliers might try to estimate what demand is. Economists might try to estimate. Lots of people might be involved. And you might do things like surveys, coupons. If you ever wonder what coupons are all about, beyond simply driving demand for a particular product, it's also a way to find out how sensitive the demand side is to changes in price. So a lot of the coupons that you see, particularly the ones that come free in the mail, really aren't that great of a deal. Maybe it's 20 cents off dishwashing liquid. That's already priced $1 more than the identical generic good. I mean, you get the idea. But it's really to determine what demand looks like. You know, in other words, what the configuration is. So things like surveys and analysis of consumer behavior allows economists to be able to plot, economists and marketers to be able to plot data. And sometimes you have some outlying data, which is sort of thrown out to the side. But if you're to use a statistical smoothing technique, you're going to be able to arrive at a downward sloping relationship that we'll simply label D for demand. And by the way, one of the mnemonic devices that has been used for a long time with demand is, because sometimes people get confused, is demand downward sloping or is it upward sloping? So if you think of D down is the mnemonic device that's downward sloping. So just think of that, D demand or demand down. And so as a result, it's a downward sloping curve. I more or less have drawn this as a straight line, as a linear function, and I'm going to sort of keep that methodology. In real life, I think most demand curves and supply curves, for that matter, tend to be more curvy than linear. In other words, or have a bit of a bend to it as opposed to a straight line, like what this is sort of illustrating. And I think that's just because we live in a curvy world. That's why there's so much of mathematics deals with mathematics curves and maximum points, minimum points, and all that. But there are functions, demand functions, that do represent or come close to being linear. And so it's not wholly unreasonable for us to use a linear curve, particularly where math is involved. And we'll sort of try to simplify this by focusing on that. So on a straight line, using that, and I think a lot of your textbook will, I think, use that more than not. It makes the math easier. Otherwise, you have to involve calculus, and we're certainly not going to go there in this class. So that's a downward sloping line. Okay. All right. So if we were to pick an ordered pair along this demand curve here, and we basically have some kind of combination of price, some P1 and some Q1 combination. Okay. So in other words, at price P1, whatever price P1 is, let's say it's $30, right? Price is P1 is $30, the quantity is 200, right? Let's say the price of the good falls to $25. So in other words, P is fallen from P1 to P2, and let's say P2 is 25. So price has gone down. Well, it's a downward sloping curve. So what will we expect to happen? We would expect quantity to go up. And as a result, Q2 now goes to say 300. Okay. And I'm just sort of making these numbers up here. I don't, you could have any kind of figures you want to have here. And so as a result, what do we got going on here? We've got a movement along the demand curve. Okay. We're going to move it along the demand curve. Now, what could cause the price to change? And we have a movement from some point, some ordered pair P1, Q1 to the new ordered pair P2, Q2. Well, it's simply due to a change in price. It's simply due to a change in price. So this is important because it's going to represent something a little bit different than an entire movement of the entire demand function. So movements along the demand curve are due only to changes in price. Okay, only to changes in price. And which we'll simply refer to as delta P. Delta P. Again, delta, everywhere delta is used pretty much in every one of the sciences or math related disciplines, refers to change that's old minus new, always. So it's due to a price change. So sliding down along the demand curve. So the price changes, the quantity demand changes, right? Assuming that quantity and price have any kind of functional relationship. Okay, so if the price changes, then we'll see a change in quantity demanded. Now, what could cause this to happen? In other words, what would cause the price to change? Well, it could be something that is happening on the supply side. And I'll probably get more into that on Thursday. Something has happened on the supply side to make the price change. Maybe it's more suppliers in the market. You have new competitors, and so now new competitors are flooding the market with goods. The price goes down, so now more people are buying those quantities, right? We see this happening all the time where there are producers making outsized profits, and there's demand for the good, and maybe even demand is rising over time. And so you've got new competitors, and as a result, the price comes down, and we end up having a lot of price competition as buyers look to price as being a key driver of their demand decisions. Price isn't everything, but price is a big thing, right? And we know price isn't everything, because if price were everything, everyone would buy generics all the time. But we know that that's not the case. Or we buy the very cheapest product we could find. But then I think a lot of people have determined, probably rightly so in most cases, that there's a definite connection in price and quality. And so if you want high quality, you end up having to pay a higher price for it. Okay. So movements along the demand curve could be only due to a change in price. Now, it doesn't say here why the price changed, but it could be, as the example I just gave, something going on the supply side, or it could be simply due to maybe a government mandate. There are occasions, and we're not really going to get into this in this class. If you read in chapter 3, there's a discussion of price controls. If you're reading that, if you can read it, it's fine, but we're not going to be covering it. it's really a micro topic, and for those of you who take micro or will take micro, you'll know get that there. I'd rather get into macro as quickly as possible, but it could be sometimes government does set price controls in order to limit the price of a good that's too high. So, for instance, if it's determined the price of gasoline is too high, then maybe the government will say, okay, it can be no more than X, right? Some P2 as opposed to P1. Obviously, 30 and 25 don't make sense for gasoline, but you get the idea. Right now, for example, there's a big movement going on among a lot of consumer activists in Washington to try to limit the price of prescription drugs, to try to get Congress to weigh in on this, to try to limit the price increases. In fact, some of the prices of consumer drugs really make no sense from the standpoint of comparing it to cost. You get the idea, a very strong idea, that pharmaceutical companies will charge pretty much whatever they can get away with. And when they can't get away with it, they will stop charging those particular prices. So anyway, again, more controversy that we get into in macro. We just can't help to avoid it. Okay. All right. So demand is a relationship between price and quantity. And it's the ability and willingness to purchase goods at various prices and quantities. These are the definition. So this gives way then to what is this functional relationship here? And it gives way to one of the only two laws of economics that we've got: law of demand, and we'll get into law of supply here in a minute. So what is the law of demand? Now there are some other laws of economics. There's something called Okun's law, which I don't recall whether that's in this particular book. It's not really a law. It's more just sort of called that in honor of the particular economist who came up with it. Really, there are only, unlike mathematics and physics and chemistry, there are really only two laws of economics, and one of those laws has some violators, like law of demand. But for the most part, these are pretty hard and fast relationships. So what is it? It's the functional relationship between price and quantity. And the law of demand basically says there is an inverse relationship. An inverse, indirect, negative, whatever you want to say, inverse relationship between price and quantity. Okay? An inverse or negative relationship between price and quantity. So price we know as P, right? And quantity, but we're going to sort of modify quantity here, and we're going to call it Q sub D, D for demand, obviously, because it's going to be quantity demanded. And we're going to differentiate quantity demanded from quantity supplied. And that's going to make a difference when we sort of bring supply and demand together in the same model. So the inverse, so this is the functional relationship between these two factors, price and quantity. An inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. And what is that functional relationship? It basically goes like this: if the price of a good is rising, the quantity demanded of the good will fall. And if the price of the good will fall, the quantity demanded of the good will rise. Remember, it's a downward sloping, negatively sloped curve, or straight line, whichever you prefer. And so as a result, it gives rise to this functional relationship. And this is the law of demand, sort of in symbolic representation. P goes up, quantity demanded goes down. P goes down, quantity demanded goes up. Okay. And when I say a functional relationship, we're not really going to get too much into this in this particular class, because I know some kind of classes will get into actual demand functions. That is, like, what does the equation of demand look like? Because what have I said before with regard to how we describe economic phenomena, to students? There are really three main ways. We can describe it verbally. We can just simply say what's going on, and that may suffice if it's fairly easy to understand, doesn't have a lot of moving parts and whatnot. We can draw a graph, which is a little bit simpler to see, and we can sort of see movements and parts, different variables and whatnot. And for those of us who are visual, it seems to be very useful. Some of us are more visual than others. Some of us are not particularly visual at all. And the third way is by mathematical representation, which not everyone is really into, but some really, really like. So for instance, if we were to describe a demand function, right? So a demand function is simply the functional relationship between price and quantity. So as a result, you might have a demand function looks something like this. That'd be P equals, let's give this example, 50 minus 0.5 Q. Okay. And we're not really going to be dealing with trying to solve these particular problems. But this is a linear expression, right? This is in the form of y equals mx plus b, just we've got the slope over here, which is a negative slope. It's a negative sign, right? So, and the slope is negative 0.5, right? 50 would be the vertical intercept, which would be somewhere up here. So let's just say 50, right? That would be the functional relationship between those two particular goods. Meaning that 50, there's no quantity demand at all for whatever this good is. And as the price comes down, then we have an increase in quantity demand based upon the fact that this is going down, this is also going to rise. Remember, these are inversely related. Okay. So this is kind of an example of what a demand function might look like. You can also express Q in terms of P and whatnot. It's particularly, you know, and if you get into 300 level economics, you'll probably will deal with that. Or if you take micro somewhere else, some instructors do like to get into that. The only reason I'm giving you this here is so you can get an appreciation for the fact that there is a mathematical relationship between price and quantity. And I want to be clear here because I know that sometimes there's I think a tendency to imagine that, well, this is just sort of professors on boards who are just saying, well, this is what demand must look like. It has to be this, it can't be any other way. What we're saying is that demand estimation is a real thing. It's done all the time. And constructing demand curves are a lot of what economists do, particularly microeconomists who are studying individual markets. And this basic market model that we've got here is really sort of a micro model. But to the extent that macro is springboards off of the basics of micro, we should cover this here because we're going to be using some of these very same concepts in terms of movement and shifts and whatnot as we progress further into the class. Okay. All right. So there is demand. Any questions about what the basic configuration of demand is? Well, I want to do this. I want to talk about the fact that this is not locked in stone, this demand curve. It can change, and I think I've mentioned this before, that it's one thing to sort of be moving along the curve here based upon some change in price. The change in price could be due to something going on the other side of the market, that is on the supply side, or some government interaction or whatever, or it could be the demand itself is changing. So let's talk about that particular scenario where demand itself is changing. Because we know that demand is something changing. So when you have a demand curve, I have likened it to this, that any kind of demand function that you want to deal with here on a PQ sort of plane is something that we ought to just be able to take a picture of and say, okay, right now, this is what demand looks like. Okay, so we have it, and we'll just simply keep the linear downward sloping demand, and we'll simply call that D1. Okay. D1 as the sort of the beginning demand curve. And let's say that we've got some ordered pair that falls along this way. We've got some price. And let's say the price is 40 or whatever. And the quantity here is, we'll call it P1. And the quantity is 150. Okay. I'm just making numbers up here. It doesn't really make any difference. I hope you guys can see that. That's not too small. Because I can see what's going on the screen here, but maybe you can blow it up at home if you're able to do that. But I know that when I look at this on my laptop, I can just sort of enlarge it, just hit Control plus sign, and it gets bigger and bigger. Okay, so there's a demand curve that's going on there. Okay, all right. So let's say that the price isn't changing, but let's say the price is relatively fixed here. And let's not call that P1. Let's just call it P. And let's say something's happening. So economists now realize that this D1. Going to take a picture of it, right? Because it's not going to be the same. It's going to change. What if economists believe that by observation are now able to ascertain that now the demand curve is moving this direction? And so as a result, now we no longer have some D1, we've got some D2. In other words, there's a shift in the demand function. Okay? There's a shift. In this case, it's a rightward shift. So what's going on is this. You've got a rightward shift. which means that the same price of 40 not only is Q not the right quantity now, but at the same price, maybe it now goes to 225. So at the same price. In other words, there's a shift. And let's talk about this idea of shift. This is not a price change. This is a change in demand itself. And I want to emphasize there's a difference between quantity demand and demand. It doesn't seem like it. And in fact, economists themselves sort of make this violation of talking about a change in demand when they really mean change in quantity demand, which is what a movement along the demand curve is. This is a shift in overall demand. So a shift, right? A shift in demand is a change in overall demand. It's a change in overall demand. Okay? In other words, what's going on here is the demand function changes. Something functionally is going on. In other words, the math equation has changed, right? The demand function is changing, whatever the case might be. Okay? Now, in this particular case, we've got a rightward shift. Okay? Now, this is very important because I want everybody to make sure that you have got this squared away. And that is, when we think about a change in demand or a change in supply, I want everybody to reorient themselves to a very important point on the graph. That's this thing right here, the origin, okay? Think of a number line. So if you're going to on a number line, if you're going to the right, you're increasing the value. And if you're going to the left, and remember, these are all positive values, positive against positive. But forget about this guy, think about the number line like this. And as we go this direction, we're going down. So when we talk about a shift, this is a rightward shift. And so a rightward shift, right? A rightward shift is an increase in overall demand. So it's an increase in overall demand. So what I like everybody to think of is not up, down, but right, left. A rightward shift is an increase in overall demand. So don't think of up, but think of down. Don't think of right. And the reason I say this is because it's particularly going to be useful when we talk about supply, because it's going what looks like an increase there actually is a decrease. And so if you think up, down, you're going to maybe get yourself tied in knots. It's not the same particular thing. A rightward shift is an increase in overall demand. What does that really mean? For every P, there is greater quantity demanded. Okay, there's a greater quantity demanded. The price hasn't changed, the function has changed. Okay, and so what might be happening here? Okay, well, all right, remember here we had an intercept of 50, right? So let's say now that this has moved to the right, now we've got an increase. Let's say the slope hasn't changed. The slope of these are relatively the same here. Maybe now this first equation, equation 1 was that. Maybe now the equation goes to 80 minus 0.5 q. In other words, the thing is shifted upwards. Or, well, there I go. It's shifted to the right, but it's an increase. Shifted to the right, but it's an increase. So as a result, now we've got a higher intercept point. Meaning for every price that is given here, there's a greater quantity demanded. So something is causing an increase in demand, overall demand. And what could that be? That'll be a subject we get to on Thursday. But one final thing before we wrap this up here is that we've got shifts going one way, shifts going the other way. What about a shift that might be happening in the other direction? What if economists note that demand is actually going this direction now? And maybe we're even at a lesser point than where we began with. And so now we've got a decrease in demand. In other words, a leftward shift in demand. And again, think about not up, down, but rather right, left. And so as a result, now what have we got? We've now got some, we've got some D3 corresponds to Q3, and now we've got some quantity of 90. All at the same price of 40, remember. And so what can we say about a leftward shift? Well, it's basically this. It's nothing too much different. And all I'm going to do is sort of adjust this. You can sort of adjust this on your notes, but it's a leftward shift. So it's a leftward shift is a decrease in overall demand. There is a lesser quantity demanded at every price. A lesser quantity demanded for every P. So what might be happening here? Well, it could be that now we've got equation 3. These are simply demand functions, and I'm not going to be working. You're not going to have to face these on exams. You're just simply going to want to know that they exist. And so now it could be a case in which we've got maybe a lesser, and the way I'm drawing this, I'm going to come in somewhere greater than 40. And so let's say now it goes to say 47, right? So P equals 47 minus 0.5 cubed, right? So, and all we're saying is that there's a decrease in demand. It's a decrease in overall demand. So what's happening is there's less demand. Maybe buyers are leaving the market, whatever. But these are examples of what could change with regard to shifts in demand and shifts in supply. And so when we talk about these shifts in demand, the final thing I'll talk about here before we wrap up today's discussion is we're talking about a change in overall demand. In other words, if a demand curve itself, D1 or D2, is simply a snapshot of, you take a picture with your phone, well, then these changes from D1 to D2 to D3 will be more of a video that is over time, whereas you have these particular movements, right? And let's talk about what could be going on with regard to this, right? And I want to be clear, there's a difference between the movements along the demand curve and shifts in demand. These shifts are changes in overall demand, and they are due to changes in non-price variables. Non-price variables. So movements along the demand curve are due to changes in price. Shifts in demand are due to changes in non-price variables. These are non-price variables. And these non-price variables are simply what we refer to as determinants of demand. Determinants of demand. In other words, they are the secret sauce, the DNA of what goes into making up this demand equation in the first place. That is, what constitutes demand? What are the factors that are driving demand? And they're not price, okay? It's not the price of the good. And it could be due to the price of other goods. And we'll get into this on Thursday when we begin our class discussion. We'll talk about things like changes in other goods that may cause a shift in demand, changes in income, changes in tastes and preferences of buyers. All these different factors are things that can influence the change in the price of the good. So that'll be where we pick up on Thursday. And then what we'll do is we'll then talk about the supply curve and the supply function, the law of supply, etc. Then we'll put demand and supply together, and then hopefully we'll have a bit of time left after we do that and talk about what markets look like once we have combined demand and supply together to form what we call equilibrium. That is a case of short-term balance in a market. It's what equilibrium is everywhere, really, short-term balance. And then we'll try to get into some of the content from chapter 6. And I know, and I'm very confident that we will not get all the way through chapter 6 with it's a very rich, dense chapter, but it will at least give us our foot in the door to transitioning away from the basics, and it'll be all macro all the time once we start getting into chapter 6. But these are some important fundamentals because they sort of lay out for us these dynamics, the dynamics of how markets work. Okay. So questions for me about anything we've talked about so far today? Okay, well, I will make this video available hopefully later today, Tuesday, and when we meet on Thursday, we'll pick it up from here and we'll continue and we'll finish up our discussion of what are these shifters of demand. Shifters are non-price variables, aka determinants of demand. Then we'll get into supply and go from there. So, okay, so if anybody has any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Otherwise, we'll say goodbye for now. Everybody have a great day, and I'll see you on Thursday.